Mr. President, thank you very much for giving platform time for this very ill-assorted trio. Only real conjuncture is that we're all fellows of the Society of Antiquaries. And I must say I'm extremely grateful for those who unwisely elected me to be an antiquary. Secondly, I think I ought to say thank you very much for coming this evening and hearing about this little-known house in, well, not very little-known, but mildly little-known house in East Brighton, which Tim and Adrian have been working on, elucidating the history for a very long time. Now, this is about the occupation of this house for since 1550 by the same family, or nearly the same family. We have to say it is almost entirely the Strickland family, and I have to explain why my name is not Strickland, somehow or other. If you look at the family tree, you will see that it comes directly from father to son, without a break for a son-in-law or an heiress or a nephew or anything like that, because I think probably it's fairly unusual in being completely direct all the way down to 1938, when the last male Strickland died, and it was inherited by the Marriott family. And that was because of a miscalculation. When Sir George Strickland, who you will see there in his pomp and glory around about 1870, will notice that he had a very bad hunting accident. So he's got a stick and a very badly broken leg. I got a stick, but I never had a hunting accident. But Sir George, around about 1870, would have thought that there was bound to be a male Strickland heir, because his son had had 4 sons, all of whom were living and alive. But the problem was that, first of all, his eldest son, who was named by Walter William, was highly unusual. He made it quite clear, almost from the start when he was a teenager, that he didn't want anything to do with his lineage. And he made it abundantly clear when he got married at Boynton Church to Miss Eliza Boakes, and left her at the church door, and never, as far as we know, he never saw her again. So that meant that he was never going to have, unless he remarried, which actually looked rather unlikely too, he was never going to have a legitimate heir to the baronetcy. And that's why his name on the lineage is in brackets. The Sir is in brackets. He never wanted to be called Sir. So just have a look at that awkward old man who relied on the fact that one of his 4 grandsons was going to have a male Strickland heir. Constable, Strickland constables, I'm happy to say that we've got the Sir Fred Strickland constable, who will see, go back again, at the bottom of the list there, Sir Fred is here tonight, and he has managed to join the Strickland and the constable names together. The constables were well provided for. Sir George's second son was called Strickland Constable, which you'll see from the previous thing, and his mother, who I think fairly early, having provided 4 children, didn't really, was not very popular with her husband somehow. So it's very difficult, without actual facts, it's very, very difficult to sort out one thing from another. But that looks likely that he said, well, the constables fend for themselves, it's the Stricklands who ought to get Boynton. However, Sir Walter William, brackets Sir, didn't want to have anything to do with that. He had 2 younger half-brothers who, remember, Henry and Frederick. And the unlikely event happened. First of all, that between them they had 4 daughters. And secondly, that much older half-brother outlived them. Now, if there had been a male Strickland in the 1930s, Boynton would have taken a different course. As it was, it went to my uncle, James Edmund Marriott, who, going back again briefly, you'll see on the right-hand side, Reverend Robert Marriott, 1, 2, 3, 4 reverends, and I'm the only sort of living eldest son, bar one, who hasn't been in the church. I leave it to you to judge how wicked that means I am. But there's a long line of Sparsons, and the Marriotts at Coatsbatch, representing my younger son, James, have been just celebrated 250 years in Coatsbatch this year. Well, that's a short time compared to the Stricklands, but that was when you can see Lucy Henrietta married the Reverend James Powell, and then for a lack of male Stricklands, it came to my Uncle James, who inherited Boynton in 1945. And then the 40s were, after the war, a very, very bad time for houses and families. And I think they gave up hope that they could go on there as they were used to, as Boynton was used to going on. So it was sold in 1950, and he went off to Jersey, where eventually his son Robert, who was not inclined to be a land gent anyway, and eventually his daughter Patricia inherited a lot of stuff which came after there was a sale at Boynton in 1950, and then a good many things went over to Jersey. The most significant thing was that there is my Uncle Jim, and he was a firing instructor in the Royal Flying Corps during the war, and his granddaughter, Mary Ferris, is here now, from Canada. Her mother, Patricia, married a second husband, a Canadian, a wonderful man called Matt McCann. And the Ferris family have been the guardians of the archives at Boynton ever since then. And now it would be impossible to write the history of Boynton without access to these archives. And we are deeply grateful, not just me, but anyone who's seriously interested, deeply grateful for the fact that we can have access to the Strickland family papers were piled up in Fredericton, New Brunswick. In the internet age, everything is possible once you get access, and of course, many will know, not only possible, but more accessible than if you had to actually handle the documents. Why is my name Marriott? It is because my wife and I turned up with my brother Oliver and his wife at Boynton one day and said, our Uncle Jim used to live here, can we look round? And I had an instant love affair, as a result of which we bought Boynton and have lived there extremely happily ever since, for just over 30 years. Now, I've run out of time, I'm quite sure, because I will now switch off and leave the floor to the people who know more about it than I do.
This project has been in the making for over 25 years. It began with an attempt to sort out the architectural phasing of Boynton Hall near Bridlington, as you can see on this Google map. Sorry about that. And it began to look at the phasing of the building, extended to the surrounding buildings, followed by the need to understand the landscape and gardens, and the need to interpret all this in terms of ownership, wealth, social and political trends and style. Tonight, we're offering just a few elements of this work to illuminate the 4 centuries of all these elements concentrating on one house. More follows in the book. Basically, Boynton Hall lies in the valley of the Gypsy Race, which is marked in blue down the centre, running east-west, in the Great Road Valley. And the original settlement was in fact a long Anglo-Saxon road village which ran to the original, subsequently moved road in the middle of the valley. So I'll go through these elements at the same time just to explain them. At the crossroads on the main east-west road to Bridlington, there was a church, St Andrew's, first recorded in 1120, when it was gifted to Bridlington Priory, and the vicarage was ordained in 1268. In the Domesday Survey, Boynton is associated with the manor of Bridlington, although the parish was in fact divided between several manors. Boynton was not at this time a manorial centre, and it seems to have continued through to the 14th century as a row village, marked in red, of tofts and various peasant tofts. Some of these to the south of the church were in fact abandoned when the village flooded as a result of the variable water table in the bottom of the valley. Just to put on the valley stream itself, to clarify that there is the stream, the Gypsy Race. I haven't wiggled the line all the way along it. And then also to make clear that the main road to which the road village belonged runs towards Bridlington from Rudston and on to York. So up until the 14th century, Boynton was divided between several estates, but subsequently not all of the parish was acquired by the Maynell family in 1428. I apologise for the history, but it's important. The Maynell estate in 1428 passed into the hands of Thomas Lord Swinford and to a family called the Newports later in the 15th century. It was then that the first manor house was constructed, you'll notice, on the other side of the Gypsy Race and away from the road itself. The manor house, which we know quite a lot about and which we'll deal with later, was subsequently sold with the estate that went with it to William Strickland, which is where our story begins, in 1549. So we know, and this is just to give you an idea, we know that we have a medieval manor house on the site, which is 15th century, and I'll come back to that in a moment. However, to enlighten the proceedings, I thought I'd start by briefly saying something about William Strickland. William Strickland was the son of Roger Strickland of Marske, who was described as a sea captain. Roger had amassed considerable wealth and purchased landholdings at Wintringham, which I'm not going to deal with today, by the time of his death in 1521. This is where we get into the story. William, we know, inherited this estate at a young age and added lands at Hildonley, Place Newton, all in East Yorkshire, before purchasing Boynton. William has often been associated and credited with the building of the current footprint of Boynton Hall, but our work clearly indicates this was not the case. It appears that having purchased a medieval hall, what he did was embellish it and alter it, but the size of the hall in its own right was particularly impressive. However, before turning to the house, it's worth considering the social context and personage of William Strickland himself. We have no known birth date for him, but he died in 1598, and I quote, at a great age. He married Elizabeth Strickland, the eldest daughter of Walter Strickland of Sizer, which my colleague Adrian pointed out was probably an upwardly mobile match. That's very important. William was granted a coat of arms in 1550. Coat of arms comprised a turkey. This is very significant, believe it or not. And he was clearly connected, well connected, with supporters of the Somerset Protectorate. He was also clearly a Protestant, a well-developed, hard line, if I may say, Protestant. He was presumably out of favour during Mary's restoration of Catholicism, and it appears that it was during this period that he began to develop Boynton Hall beyond its medieval appearance. Swiftly, William was elected an MP in 1585, it sat through 4 Elizabethan parliaments. The point about William, which is well attested to, is that he was in fact a severe Protestant. He earned the sobriquet Strickland in Parliament. He was in fact removed at one stage by the Privy Council because he wanted to abolish confirmation and prevent priests from wearing vestments. And at the end of the practice of kneeling in communion, there were considerable problems, and there was a row in Parliament at the time, but he got back in because he was so well connected. So let's start off with the famous turkey. Why did William have the turkey? If you look at earlier versions of the DMB, it is apparently because he introduced the turkey to England with the capots. This would have been extremely difficult unless he'd been at least 110, because he couldn't have sailed with the capots at all. And it's interesting because I think the chances are, we're very clear about this, that the turkey was chosen because it was a rare bird at the time for the family crest. The myth of the turkey is used later by the family, possibly to avoid any reference to Strickland the Stinger and his parliamentary activities against the church. I show here a posthumous portrait of William. Here he is in all his glory. There's nothing in this portrait that suggests William was painted, this was painted before 1640. So it's a bit after his death in 1598. And what's particularly impressive about it is, this is the sobriquet, the navigator. You'll notice in the background is Farnborough Head, which is on the wrong side of the country to sail to North America if you were looking for turkeys. Better still, in this small circle here, you will note that there is a man in a ship which looks remarkably like a Lübeck lugger, probably because the portrait artist was from Lübeck, North Germany, yeah? And you'll see there's a sail, a small figure, and between his legs, I promise you, there is a turkey. William inherited, therefore, what we're fairly clear, and we're not going to go through the details tonight because I don't want to bore you, but we're fairly clear, a fairly simple medieval building, very impressive ashlar constructed cellar block possibly, a hall. We know about the Screen's Passage, we know the position of the kitchen now for the first time clearly, and we also know there was a garden area. That's what he inherited. What's interesting from our point of view is the work that we've subsequently carried out on the house, which indicates that William was not building the current footprint of the house, he was in fact developing it. We think he carried out a number of pieces of work, including an ornamented bay window, which you'll see marked, a separate staircase, and obviously he kept his hall, which you'd expect, I think, and Screen's Passage, and we have some problems in the area here, which we still have to get. So there's an invisible William living at Boynton House, which we think we can now demonstrate existed, and I can give you more detail. So there's William establishing himself at Boynton, gent, coat of arms, everything else, and I would rather think of him, as I still do, as William Strickland, the Stinger, but there's a matter of choice. So that's the origins of the house. We have the medieval manor house, we have William's developments of the house, and we now move on to Walter Strickland, his first son. Walter styles himself quite deliberately Walter Strickland of Boynton on the Wold. It's therefore clear that the family is establishing itself at Boynton, even though it doesn't own all the village and it doesn't own or have the church living. Very quickly, Walter is the man who established the current hall footprint. He had to raise the house. I mentioned flooding earlier on from the Gypsy race. His style is very clear. He doesn't appear to have served as an MP, but he does appear to have spent a large amount of time setting up the family seat. And what he did, and this is where you see the incorporation of the medieval wall with the earlier part of the building, is he establishes a great house in a gabled H plan, staircases at either end, and also probably is certainly responsible for the initial lodgings range, and probably also for the banqueting hall. All these dates needed to be sorted out. We now have brick dates which will confirm most of our findings. The interesting thing is, of course, that Walter had to raise the house by well over a metre. to get it to its present level. We've been lucky, we've carried out a number of what I think you might call keyhole excavations to combine with this work in order to make our points. We suspect at this point that we have in fact got a walled garden running round the house. We have at the bottom, lower down, in fact, but not clear on this photograph, I apologise, a medieval garden there. And then subsequently we have the make-up, and it'll be covered by Adrian, the make-up to this early 17th century house, and above that, in fact, we have further make-up for the alterations that were done by later Stricklands. So this garden raising level means that we have a whole buried archaeology, which unfortunately, of course, lies under the owner's garden. I'm grateful to his wife for allowing us to do the work we did. It's difficult replacing the law. So what William had, the dates are slightly wrong here, but what William basically had was a gable-ended, very, very nice early Jacobean mansion, which is given based on a later sketch, which I'm showing you here. We've got the brick dates for this house. Of course, subsequently there are alterations made to it, but that footprint of the 1603 Jacobean building is what you actually see today in this main frontage. We think the banqueting hall, which we've also investigated extensively, is also around the same date, which you'd expect in this sort of residence. And then I'm going to move swiftly on to look at the Civil War and the Commonwealth. It's very, very important because family myths, which we also want to mention briefly here, are fascinating. Walter's son, Sir William Strickland, first baronet, is created in 1641. There are a whole clutch of baronets is being handed out by Charles I in this period as we move towards the Civil War. William is particularly interesting because he was MP. His brother, second son of Walter, was Cromwell's agent in The Hague, and they were in fact heavily supportive, obviously, of the Commonwealth during the Civil War. One of the interesting things, just briefly on this, is that there is a rumour also in the family papers, widely republished, that Henrietta Maria, when she landed at Bridlington, sheltered at Boynton. We're now very clear she didn't. She sheltered at Burton Agnes with the nearest black family. It's not surprising because, of course, during that period of time, there were some difficulties for the Strickland family. But they emerged quite successfully at the end. I'm looking at Adrian to make sure I've got it right. Now, the final bit I'm just going to do briefly tonight is the business about the landscape itself. If we ignore the next baronet, Sir Thomas, briefly, although he undoubtedly did some work on the house which we can point to, William, in fact, introduces extra money into the family, and this is where we see some significant changes. William was a Whig, Protestant, campaigned against James II, Henry connections. What I'm going to deal with just briefly tonight to give you another sort of glimpse is what happened during this period to the landscape around the house. On this LiDAR, marked in yellow, is one of the, you can probably see the ridge and furrow, I hope you can, on this field here, is the LiDAR. This land had already fallen into the hands, obviously, of the family, and this is a period when emparkment and increasing landscape usage takes place. The house is here, and I'm going to look at this feature here, which is variously called the Hollow Way, the Lover's Lane, and also this rather nice feature cutting through the medieval landscape, which we carried out some investigation of. So it's a dead straight line from the front door of the house, and remember I said that Boynton, because it's where it is, if you make the decision to continue to build there, at the bottom of the valley, you will have to cope with an interesting landscape. What happens here is that in this period, we think 1684, but we could argue about that, there's an attempt to widen the landscape from the front of the house to not just looking at a ridge. And this is done by this method of developing what we call an inverted terrace, which winds up at the top of the hill with what I call a glade, or a viewing area for the rest of the house. This gives you the same shot. Here is the house, down here, the medieval field, which is part of the park by then, is out in this area here, and we're just looking at this one trajectory to give you a glimpse. So here's the house, looking up the hill, as it were, and here is this inverted terrace, carefully surveyed, to give a view down the hill to the house. At this point in time, of course, there were no trees in this landscape. All these yew trees are much later, and in my view, spoil the view. Excavations on this, which we carried out relatively recently, demonstrated it was in fact a chalk cut. We haven't calculated the exact number of tons of chalk that were moved. Part of them we know where they were making up the landscape to continue to heighten it. And I just want to draw your attention briefly to this point that the actual way is a walkway in the middle of this cut. It is not meant for trafficking at all. It is in fact start to park impartment and widening the landscape. I hand over to Adrian.
Great, thanks Tim. I'm now going to talk about the development of Boynton from the late 17th century through to the late 18th century. There's very little, if any, interior features that date from before the late 17th century. There was possibly a fire, but most significantly of all, there was a marriage to this handsome lady, who is certainly an oil painting, who was a Ure heiress from Malton, the Ure's farm family of Malton. And this marriage brought in a very significant amount of money in the dowry, and the marriage is commemorated in this late 17th century plastered ceiling. And the staircase is of the same date, and the staircase is replacing what would have been a full stair up to the top floor. Tim didn't mention it, but there would have been a long gallery and so forth in the Jacobean house. This accesses a first floor saloon. And we think all of this relates to the marriage after 1680, 1682, an inheritance of the baronetcy and the estate in 1684. This, I'm sorry, it's rather pale. Oh, actually, it's come out better on the screen than it does on the computer. This is Buck's sketch of about 1720. What's really significant here is that we've got still the enclosed courtyard garden around the house. We've got gate piers, which we assume are also 1680s. They're now positioned there. We've got the suggestion, I think, in Buck's drawing of that inverted terrace running up the hill behind us. And we've got the central entrance. So whereas the medieval entrance to the house had been here, with a cross passage at the screen's end of the hall, from the later 17th century, that concern with symmetry results in the central entrance to the house. And there may have been some other sorts of alterations made on what appear to be full-height pilasters on that central entrance. And what we're suggesting is that creating that central entrance in the 1680s and the gate piers and the inverted terrace, if you'll accept that term, all go together in one move. The other thing which is interesting here is that this is actually the oldest standing structure on site. This is the lodgings range, which is Elizabethan. It becomes the service range. It would originally have been for horses and servants and so forth sleeping above. And if you can see there is actually the projecting kitchen. And it's one of the significant features of Boynton that the services are here, and all of this house is living space for the family. So it's actually quite a considerable space in terms of the house, because the services are in this range. The brick dating, which my colleague at Durham, Ian Bailey, has been able to do, we dated a brick from this originally lodgings range, 1680, which would relate to its rebuild of that 1680s period, and then this pediment is added in the subsequent phase to Boynton, which we'll come on to in a moment, where the whole house is given a Palladian treatment in about 1730, and this lodging range, which then becomes the kitchens and so forth, gets its pediment at that point as well. Okay, I'm just going to mention very briefly that the Stricklands, of course, were not always resident of Boynton. In fact, going through the papers in Canada really brought home to me how rarely the Stricklands were at Boynton. And often, I think, when we focus on specific houses, we have a very vivid sense of the family being there. But of course, they were only often there in the summer in some generations, or at Christmas. And in the 17th century and early 18th century, as was so common, it was actually the townhouse in Malton, which was the major centre for sociability, particularly horse racing and the political arrangements, with the family serving usually as MP for Malton or Scarborough. This is York House as it survives today. Itself, it's a 15th century building in origin. It was done over, or I should say remodelled, in 1684 for the same couple, and it was again given a Georgian treatment in about 1720, and again some further alterations in 1730. It also, interestingly, has vestiges of the terraced historic garden. And there's a very, very good detailed analysis of the house by Nigel Copsey, who's done a great deal of work on York House, which is available online. Okay, back to Boynton. This couple who are married in the 1680s are very busy at Malton. That handsome lady who we saw in the oil painting was from Malton. The ewes and the farms were the major family in Malton. And horse racing was developing in the 17th century, particularly at centres such as Malton. And this is what would originally have been a very handsome stable block built at Boynton by that couple. And it hasn't come out as terribly well here, but it really is very, very good quality brickwork. And these sash windows are later, it would have had mullioned windows, and that's the entrance. I wanted to show this slide rather than have something more crisp, because it shows the fact that this has always been sort of farm-yardy area of Boynton, and this has always been a sort of rustic track. And the gardens you already have seen are actually immediately behind us, in the banqueting house behind where I'm standing. The brick sample, which we took from about there, didn't date, frustratingly, but we assume, particularly on stylistic grounds, that it's 1680s, 1690s. The third baronet and his wife were spending considerable amounts, not least on horse racing and building, and got into quite significant debt built up largely by mortgages, which it takes much of the 18th century to clear. Okay, the Strickland papers, which Richard mentioned, when the estate was sold in about 1950, a member of the family, who clearly had an antiquarian impulse, I think, took the papers to Canada, and they've been cared for by the Ferris family in Fredericton, New Brunswick since. And I'm very grateful to have had the opportunity to go through the papers in New Brunswick. And I just want to offer you a summary here of quite how rich those papers are. There are title deeds from the 16th and 17th centuries, very, very detailed estate records and accounts from the later 17th through to the 19th century, manorial court records which demonstrate that the manors of the Boynton estate were not at Boynton, actually. It was Carnaby to the south and North Burton to the north. So the estate was actually quite dispersed. Inheritance documents, unsurprisingly, poems and plays, and so forth. And then these particularly significant records, not directly relevant to Boynton, but they relate to the government of Yorkshire and ultimately the government of the British Empire, because the most politically successful Strickland, who is the next generation, born in 1686, who became very active in the Whig ministry of Walpole, was Commissioner of the Revenue, Lord of the Treasury, Treasurer of Queen Caroline's household, Privy Councillor and Walpole's Secretary for War. All his papers for the army are in the New Brunswick papers, and they document, army widows writing in pensions and so forth, as well as Gibraltar, Jamaica, Nova Scotia and so forth. So very, very rich for our project, but also much, much wider potential. This next generation is Sir William Strickland, the guy who ends up as Secretary of State for War, born to that couple in the 1680s. This is the copy of a conversation piece by Phillips, and this is in the overmantel at Boynton. This is the contemporary copy. I'd be extremely grateful if anybody has any idea where that might be, if it was anywhere ever. This lady, Sir William's wife, was from the Sambrook family, and there was an estate in the home counties called Thorpe, which I'm going to ask you, is it Essex? Is that the right county? And it's possible it might be Thorpe. And the detailed account books that Sir William Strickland kept, which are in the Strickland papers, what they demonstrate is that he was going out from London often at the weekends to Thorpe, and he was very active with his garden at Thorpe. He was also very active, as we'll come on to in a moment, with the Queen's Gardens at Richmond. This isn't, we don't think, Boynton. And in fact, what's very clear from the papers is that it was only generally in August and sometimes at Christmas that couple were at Boynton. So we're now moving on from the generation that was so busy in the 1680s, 1690s, to their successor, who was this Whig grandee, playing cards with Walpole and the Whig ascendancy, as it were, and he purchased a house on Grosvenor Square. And I am assuming from the papers in Canada that this is a plan of the Grosvenor Square house. It's a double plot. And there's very, very strong detail for the development of the Grosvenor Square house in those papers, including that the sash windows are being made for the Grosvenor Square house and for Boynton at the same time, and that the Boynton windows are shipped up to Bridlington from London. I'm also, and I'm open to correction on this, I'm assuming this unidentified piece of paper in the papers may relate potentially to an interior in Grosvenor Square, but I'm very much open to advice on that. Okay, so back to Boynton. Sir William, as a Whig grandee, was very much involved with the sort of Burlington Palladian project, and he wants to transform his Jacobean Gothic house. And that's what he creates. So we've got this very considerable Jacobean H-plan house in brick with a diapering. You may even be able to spot the sort of where the larger mullioned windows would have been. And then this Palladian treatment is given to the house by Sir William. And as I'll come on to in a moment, that is very much done to a design by Burlington. And we've got the record, the actual document of Burlington's drawing in Burlington's hand. Now, the only time Boynton ever gets mentioned in main architectural histories is because of a letter by the later 18th century sort of amateur architect Thomas Robinson from the 1760s. He reports a story that this Palladian treatment of Boynton had been executed in Sir William's absence, and it hadn't been done according to the instructions. So I'm just going to read this letter, which is 1760s, reporting on 1730. So the quote from the letter is, "The overlooker or clerk of the works often thinks himself wiser than the architect," and this is why it's often used in architectural history as a sort of general point. "A remarkable instance happened at old Sir William Strickland's in Yorkshire. Lord Burlington gave him a beautiful design with a Palladian roof and an attic story, instead of garrets and the old, wretched and ugly roof of our Gothic ancestors. When the house was completed, Sir William went down, pleasing himself that he had improved the bad taste of his county, and should be the object of the envy of his neighbours. When, alas, he found the old-fashioned roof, and many other material alterations from the plan, he was not of a passive disposition, and said everything that rage and mortification could utter. At last, the undertaker of the building was allowed to make his defence, which was, in few words, that he took it for granted that the architect had made a mistake, Therefore, he put on the sort of roof, etc., of all seats in that neighbourhood. No reply of Sir William's could ever, however, alter the mistakes, and it was constant mortification to him while he lived. Although he didn't live very long. He died quite young at the age of 49 in 1735, and his account books are full of like, typically of Georgians, full of medical and doctors' visits. Now, I put this in particularly for the guests present. I appreciate fellows are more than aware of the significance of Burlington House. This, where we are this evening in Burlington House, this is part of this great Palladian project promoted by Lord Burlington in 1720s, 1730s. And Kent, who's significant for our story, Kent is represented in this Hogarth satire as standing atop the gateway to Burlington House, and he's being admired, supposedly, by Raphael and Michelangelo. Now, Burlington, again, I'm sure people are aware, his major estate, the estate he inherited, was at Lonsborough in East Riding, some distance from Boynton. It's off the Wolds on the Holderness Plain, and this is the sort of Kip-Nif view. Burlington was responsible for the York Assembly Rooms, promoting this promoting his vision of a Palladian Yorkshire, should we say. There's quite a nice quote, which is, again, used in Lees Milne's book, for example, which gives a nice note that Burlington and the Stricklands weren't always necessarily in each other's pockets, and that he complains in a letter to his wife about being visited by 2 Stricklands on a Sunday. Okay, now Burlington is particularly famous for creating with his architect, with William Kent, Chiswick Villa. Now, Chiswick Villa, of course, was an annex to the old house of Chiswick, which Burlington purchased. And if you notice, the old house, which lost one of its gables, is very much the same sort of house as at Boynton. And it's this treatment of the central facade which is the same as Burlington supplies in a design for Boynton. And the Chiswick house precedes the Boynton design. So look at the bottom first. I think there is exactly the same arrangement as Burlington had already achieved at Chiswick. We must assume that there was a different roof intended. In the 19th century, the Victorian generation wanted to create more of an emphasis on this door, I think, as a sort of front entrance. And there was a driveway and so forth. Anyway, so that portico or porch was removed and put on this side of the house. And Richard and Sally Marriott have, in the last decade or so, restored Burlington facade. And okay, that is Burlington's drawing for Boynton, and that's a copy of the original, which is in the papers. Okay, now I want to talk about the landscape, and we've emphasised already the emparkment to the south of the house and this great cut into the hillside. And here, it's not very clear on this, there is terracing. It also shows up on geophysical surveys. So there's the hall, there's a terrace. That's actually a prehistoric feature. That's the great park boundary, and the public road goes through here past those stables we saw earlier. It's quite important, I think, there's always a public route of access, which is the original line going up to the village. Right, Tim has put here slight visible irregular terracing, and we've got evidence for possible statue bases in this landscape as well. The most impressive of which archaeologically is this one, which we investigated, and we've got a definite base there for perhaps an urn or potentially statues, and there are other places where we think there were possibly statue bases on the top here. This is the view from the house. So it's the medieval inheritance of a house which is looking directly into a hillside. The level has been brought up, as Tim says, and then there are these vestigial terraces here, and that urn thing is plinth, I should say, is probably there. The terrace cut is here. Okay, this slightly repeats what we've just looked at. So what I'm going to say is that we know that Strickland was very much involved with Queen Caroline's gardens. He was involved with Charles Bridgman in creating gardens at Richmond for the Queen, and my colleague at Durham, Stephen Taylor, suggests that that English landscape garden for the Queen is partly about making Hanoverians, as it were, appear more English. We think that this relates to the 1720s, 1730s. It's possible it could be 17th century, but for reasons of the phasing in the landscape, that seems most compelling. As I mentioned, the baronet dies in 1735. It's possible that this garden scheme was perhaps in progress or not completed. We know that the estate was in poor repair during the 1740s, and there's a hilarious document where this estate steward writes a letter surveying the estate and apologising for all the dilapidations, and then says he couldn't get round to everything because of the wounds in his bottom, which I take it to mean, well, I'm sure you can guess. And then this area becomes parkland from the 1750s when the next generation inherits in 1750. Now, I'm not saying that William Kent had a direct hand in this landscape at all. It's possible, it's actually possible Bridgman may have made more contribution, or it's possible it's simply Strickland himself. But I do want to point out, A, that Kent was born in Bridlington and was taken by a group of Yorkshire gentlemen up in his patronage was by a group of Yorkshire gentlemen, which almost certainly, we don't have an absolute proof, almost certainly included the Stricklands at Boynton. And then Kent's career, of course, takes off as under the patronage of Lord Burlington. Now, these drawings by Kent of landscapes show at Claremont the whole business of how do you deal with a landscape that directly faces a house. And here you will see the statue in a wooded landscape. This one more simply has woodland on a hillside with two perms. This one I like particularly because it shows a trackway with a rustic cart, sort of public right-of-way as there was at Boynton, and a very impressive urn which would need that right-sized sort of plinth. So I'm not saying by any means that this is directly related to Boynton. I'm just saying there's an interesting relationship between the Kent sketches, which are so evocative of the interesting gardens, which we definitely know Strickland had. It's frustrating from the documentary point of view that even at Thorpe and also at Boynton, the references in Sir William's accounts are quite cursory. It's very difficult to make anything positive of them. I got very excited when I found a Bridgman plan of the garden, but it said the River Thames, and I thought, no, that's definitely not the East Riding, and it was for Richmond. Kent did supply designs for the fireplaces in the house, and I'm sorry, these are rather sort of domestic views of those fireplaces. So there is a positive Kent contribution to Boynton in the interior. David Neave tells me Kent didn't often come up, I'm just going to flick over these, come up to Bridlington once he'd established himself in London, but we know he dashed off designs to all comers, really. Right, this is the house as developed for Sir William Strickland in about 1730. It's very much there as a statement of his political position in the county. They're only resident in August and sometimes, but not always, at Christmas. And it's in this period that this former lodgings range is developed into a full service range, and there's still the original early 18th century fitted kitchen here. Actually, I mean, it's quite remarkable, the survival of the service arrangements. Okay, the next generation, and this is the last generation we're going to look at. This is Sir George and Lady Strickland in the grounds of Boynton Hall in 1751. And Sir George, who was the son of the Secretary of State for War, inherits in 1750. Well, he comes into his majority in 1750. And that long period of his minority, since 1735, meant that all the mortgages that had been built up by his grandfather were cleared. and he has a very strong hand in terms of income. This couple, unusually, are resident at Boynton almost all of the time. They make Boynton their home. For the previous generations, where the family were much, much more actively involved in national politics, Boynton was just an occasional country retreat, although it was important symbolically as their seat. Now this Devis painting shows the gypsy race having been expanded into a sheet of water to form the impression of the lake, and there we have a slightly Italianate version of the Yorkshire wolds. And Tim particularly has been able to demonstrate that that feature is, we can read that feature on the ground. For reasons of time, I won't go into proving that to you now. So this couple who inherit in 1750, painted already in 1751, they developed the house in the 1760s, employing Carr of York as their architect. And what Carr does is to create a link between the service range and the house on both floors. He creates the impression of a sort of Palladian wing to the garden very cleverly by just adding this little bit, which is something of nothing really. But it creates this impression of a great wing, and it's got the service corridor here and a service stair, which enables the servants to move around the house without passing through the main room. So that change we're very familiar with for the 18th century, and Carr also throws out this library with a bedroom suite above for, I think, St George and Strickland, and I think a nursery on the top floor. So there is Carr's Palladian sweep, and Carr, of course, has been trained by Burlington and Kent, and so he's very respectful of the architecture he's inheriting, as it were. This is the other side of the house, which we haven't seen up until now, and that's Carr's bay with a library, bedroom suites with dressing rooms, and I assume a nursery. And Carr recycles the Burlington faced windows, and he just gives a slight skim really to the service wing. We're coming almost to the end. George and Lady Strickland went on a grand tour. Rather sweetly they went together. He didn't go as a young buck. He took his wife and 2 daughters, and he brought back about a dozen marbles from Rome. This one, which I can never pronounce because I didn't have a classical education, is Terpsichore. And this one, which I can pronounce, is Juno. And this one has recently been brought back to Boynton, and they're classics of 18th century collecting. They're a combination of ancient and 18th century fabric. This is the interior of what would originally have been the medieval hall, and made into the sculpture gallery in the later 18th century. Just finally, the late Georgian landscape. We get further extensions out into the landscape. This is Lady Strickland's dairy, and this is Sir George Strickland's woolen manufactory. And then they extend out over the hill. There's a carriage drive which actually goes under the public road, and it's been made famous by the recent paintings by David Hockney of the Woldgate. But that is the late 18th century folly with a carriage drive going under the public road. And that is Carnaby Temple, which again had a very specific classical association in the 18th century. And this is on the horizon from the house, and it had an octagon room here which provided sea views out over Bridlington Bay. Now this is the final image actually. In the book, because of being able to look at the estate records, we can know a great deal about the household and the farming community at Boynton through the Manor Court records and the account books. So the ambition is to talk about the servants and the community at Boynton, not just the gentry family. And this drawing, which is loose in papers, shows the Boynton gardener in the mid-19th century. Okay, and Tim has put up these various acknowledgements. Right, I'm just going to read, by way of conclusion, what might be the opening paragraph of the publication, which is to say that Boynton Hall in the East Riding of Yorkshire is not a well-known house, and is seldom referred to by architectural historians, except to cite the story of an 18th century provincial builder bundling of patrons' instructions. The real interest of the site lies in the ways in which the house and landscape incorporates a series of changes in gentry ways of living from the 15th through to the 18th centuries, with significant alterations in almost every generation. Pevsner thought it an interesting house with a complex history, and it might have been wiser to leave it at that. This study, however, reconstructs the building and landscape history of Boynton, together with the social history of its owners, their household and estate, as an integrated archaeological and historical study. Boynton's complex history has wider interest in what it can show about the ways in which one gentry family behaved in the context of changing social relations and cultural expectations. But Boynton's residents were not merely responsive, they were also contributing to cultural change. And it's the protean as well as more passive aspects of Boynton's history and archaeology, what changed and why so much remained the same, that seems to me to be of such great interest here. And if the act of building makes a statement, then we must wonder why particular generations need to shout so loud when others go quietly on. That's it.
Thank you very much to all our speakers tonight. And just open before we have some questions by saying that how welcome it is and how appropriate that we're hearing the first fruits of your work at this absolutely appropriate time. We're very used in this room to hearing people summarising their book, or the book has just come out or whatever, but how great it is to have something where you've done the work. It's not quite there, maybe, and we know, but you're taking questions, you're throwing it open to all of us who may have different insights to think about this, but also benefit from your research. It's a perfect time. It's the kind of talk we should always be having here. And work deep into progress there, so you're confident with it, but also taking some new thoughts of how far you've got and what we want to say about it. So with that, can we have some questions, please, on the speakers or the speakers tonight? And let me just put on this microphone, which is rather close to your reason. Yes. Okay. Question mark.
Yes, Mr. President, you have given us the opportunity to ask. In furthering your research and remembering that so many Marriotts took early orders, have you yet looked at the church, which is not very far from the house, and architecturally, just to begin with? Is there evidence that the architects who worked on the house also worked on the church?
Thank you. And more questions, please?
Could I ask, just if you expand a little bit about your brick dating? I was fascinated, I assume it's typological, but you made reference to a brick that came out and didn't date, like the Dendro core. I wonder if you could say something about that. Thank you.
You said there was a sale in the 1950s. Could you expand? Did it lose all of its contents? Are you going to try and reconstruct them? I'm good at that.
And I should be interested to know whether there is a detailed listing of the archive that you mentioned, which is obviously wonderfully rich and full of all sorts of exciting things that I'm sure other scholars would like to have access to.
Yes, Simon.
Could I just ask if there are things like inventories and household bills, which would obviously build up a picture of the house and its suppliers at different stages?
Okay, some questions there for you. Who's going to? Would you like to stand up?
In answer to the question, St Andrew's, Boynton, fascinating church. All that remains, the church is reported as in a sad state of repair in the 15th century. All that remains of St Andrew's, the original structure itself, is the tower. The actual main part of the church is a tribute to Clara of York, and it's an interesting building in its own right, well worth a visit. They're still using the proper prayer book, And in addition to, which is quite important, and in addition to that, the interior contains a number of the monuments slightly repositioned. What I think is particularly interesting is I think it's the third baronet is monuments on either side of the chancel, of the upper part of the church. And they were obviously taken out of the medieval church when Carr's work was redone. And the interesting thing is, if you go into the church, and we are going to make reference to it in the book, and it's pointed out by Mike Mortimer, and it's absolutely right. The male part of the monument is actually got bunches of flowers at the bottom of it, and the female part has the coat of arms and the arms of war, because whenever they put those monuments back, there wasn't enough care taken to putting them in the right order. So there's quite a lot to do within the church itself, but it's in its own right. It's a car church, and it's very interesting. I'll leave Adrian for the rest.
Barnaby Church was also rebuilt by Carr for the same patron. The brick dating is Ian Bailiff's work at Durham. He's developed a technique of thermoluminescence dating, and I don't begin to understand the science of it, but they take a core and then they are able to measure the composition of the brick and to calculate the age at which it was fired. For reasons of scientific analysis, for some reason the core we took from the stables didn't yield a scientifically sound picture. Ian is going to give us. Ian has some further wizardry to do to refine these things, but he's confident that it's within. Within sort of 5 to 10 years, I think. He's refined it a lot. He's really made strides with this. If I understand it. That's what -5, Tim says. Yeah, I think it's really developed quite recently. The 1950 SAL catalogue, yes, which does provide an extremely full picture for the house. We don't have other comprehensive listings. There are no probative entries, probably because of continuous occupations at work, and there are various records, and some things were sold off in the 19th century. The library is dispersed in the late 19th century, and then sort of rebuilt. So, yes, the house contents, which is going to be a dimension of the publication, are captured in the 50s SAL catalogue. Yes, there is. Well, I made a list of what is present in the papers, though the papers are in private hands. Household bills and suppliers, yes, for the 18th century, not for before the 18th century. There's very, very scant material in the account of that sort. But yes, they're very rich for craftsmen and those sorts of aspects. Yeah.
Thank you. I think what's particularly interesting about this, whenever houses, particularly a house of this scale, which is not enormous, are investigated, is that you maybe have a few things in the book saying, as it happens, this is the first instance we got in the north of England or the south of England for this feature or that. But it's not really about that, is it? It's about the closeness we get by this careful investigation to opening up the bigger problems of what tends to go on with houses and doing things with them over a period of time. I'm struck by things, first of all, like, okay, it's not in the early years of expansion, the late 16th and 17th centuries, maybe in a major house the family are using, but it nevertheless sticks, though it's extended at the back, to the same kind of footprint. It's not widened or made into anything grander. You don't have a medieval house buried in something bigger, which you've had to find. That's itself very interesting, and about a certain kind of gentry ambition. And I think it's also interesting that the way, as always with these 17th century houses, when you build the compact house and you banish kitchens and service buildings to outside, where you put them, how you deal with those things, how close they are, whether you build a new or you convert other buildings, and then what's the relationship of sometimes these service buildings are almost as big as the house itself in its bodies. A lot of that going on in the mid-17th century. The lodgings range, well, I think that's interesting to all of us from a 16th century perspective, because there are very grand, as at Athol and other places, the building of these large and quite small lodgings ranges in the mid-16th century. I think that's a question we need to open up as to why they're called that. Is it a name that's given historically to that kind of building, or was it always? Maybe in the book you can tell us what documents there are as to when that first appears. And then also this fascinating business of the long English tradition of using the central classical feature, which you don't necessarily expand to the whole building. This is something I found my continental colleagues, when I talk about 16th century work, are always interested in. It's as if we don't have the courage to apply the Palladian to the whole of the building when we're adapting. Like the 16th century, early 17th century frontispiece, it's there at the centre, but it pulls the building together and gives it order. And it is a degree of sophistication of using the classical language in a very interesting and sophisticated way that doesn't rely upon a whole new dress to the outside of the building. I think it's something which is very good. And the last thing I want to say was so interesting again to hear another layer in the history of Yorkshire and its great building traditions, because of course Chiswick notwithstanding, which is a very special condition, were William Kent and people around him adapting a house of that size in the south. We all think of examples of Lord and Isham in the same period. You might go for Gothic windows. The Yorkshire classical is clearly a very deeply buried, under the skin way of doing things, because of the tremendous building activities there are there, even with the formation of the gallery. Quite close in time, maybe a decade later, the sculpture, idea of a sculpture gallery about 10 years after Newby. Not as grand a collection, obviously, but still very interesting things. Making that in a house of this size is absolutely fascinating. So I much look forward to your book. I'm sure all these issues will be further explored, and it'll be a very, very, I think, interesting new piece of the jigsaw to help us explain the development of houses over time. Thank you so much, Richard, and to our two speakers for coming and being here.
Can I just add a tiny little foot there? I think we ought to be deeply grateful for the gambling debts of the third baron. Because if he had paid, they kept much more money, it might have had Boynton transformed into a rival for Castle-Hall.